Welcome back. Ice is finally forming on the shores of Hudson's Bay. This is good news for the polar bears of Churchill, who are anxiously waiting to hunt seals off the coast. Polar bear biologist Geoff York has been observing the bears for the last few weeks from Cape Churchill, about 50 kilometers from the community. And he joins me from there out on the tundra. And Geoff, thanks for joining us. And as we can see right now, the cold weather has finally come, late this year though for the bears. What have you observed so far?
Well, that's exactly right. Canadian ice scientists are telling us that this may still yet be a historic late year for freeze-up of the bay. We've seen a dramatic change in the weather the last just 4 or 5 days. When I was out on a coastal survey about a week and a half ago, there was no ice along the shore of the entire coast of Manitoba. There was no ice to be seen in the bay. That's changed now behind me. We have much colder temperatures the last few days, high winds, and the ice conditions are perfect. And that's really good for the bears.
And so how did this affect the bears this year, this late freeze-up?
Well, this year we had sort of a double whammy. The bears came off also quite early. Darryl Edmond with Manitoba Conservation does an ice-off survey every year, and he figures most of the bears here in this area were on shore by about July 20th this year. So they've been on shore now for almost 4 months, and so that early out coupled with a late in is just causing them to have a longer period of fasting. In the spring too, that early off period is also limiting the best time of year they have to hunt. The spring is when young seal pups are out on the ice, and it's when polar bears can really make a living.
Given the current state of climate change, how does the future look for these Hudson Bay bears?
Well, everything we know, again, from both the sea ice scientists with the Canadian Sea Ice Service, from Environment Canada scientists that are studying the polar bear population here, along with University of Alberta polar bear scientists, it doesn't look good for Western Hudson Bay population, and it doesn't look very good for the polar bear population to the south in James Bay. Now, as you might imagine, these are both populations that are really on the southern fringe of where polar bears can survive, and this is where we'd expect to see sort of the earliest impacts of a warming climate, and that is indeed what we're seeing. The long-term forecast for this population, scientists are saying we might not have bears here at Cape Churchill by the end of the century.
And what does this mean for the end users, who are the Inuit, who depend on the bears?
Well, it very much depends on where those end users are. I think one thing that's often missed in this discussion is we have 19 subpopulations of polar bears around the world, and we're likely to have up to 19 different stories unfold as to how different populations in different areas respond to changes. So while things don't look so good for the polar bears here and to the south of here, for the north we're seeing slightly different stories. In some areas, populations are remaining stable. In some areas, conditions are actually becoming, at least in the short term, more favorable, and we may well be seeing more bears in some areas, particularly in the Canadian high Arctic. So it's going to be a slightly different story depending on when and where and what's happening with the sea ice in those regions.
So now that the cold snap has come to Cape Churchill, have most of the bears left both the Cape and Churchill, the community?
What we're seeing here right now in the last few days is we're seeing bears go out in the morning, and it's apparently spending some time on the ice and maybe even testing to see if it's advanced enough for them to stay out there. And we're seeing many bears come back in again in the late evening. Right about now, we're seeing bears moving off the ice. So it seems like it's this transition period, a few days here where the bears are testing, waiting to make sure the ice is solid enough for them to stay on, and then they'll be gone from here, probably within the next week.
All right, well, thanks for being our eyewitness to the event in Cape Churchill, Geoff, and thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.